Welcome. Everyone. I see some guests starting to come in. Thank you for joining us today. While we're waiting for everyone to get in here, if you don't mind posting in the chat your name and where you're calling in from, that would be awesome. Just a brief introduction of who I am. My name is Joni Weber. I am the Director of Training and Operations for the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. And I will be on this webinar today to assist with the chat and Q&A and things like that. But primarily, this webinar will be presented by our founder and CEO, Gary Schoeniger. So we are just going to give, hey, Charles, thanks for popping in the chat. Suzanne.
Charles,
nice.
what is NCLM stand for? If you don't mind, Charles, thank you. Suzanne, Free, and Patrick, SFB. What's a SFB?
We're not good
Montgomery
with
College. Okay, yeah. Right. Happy New Year to you as well.
Space Force Base. Okay.
Space Force Base. Wow, awesome.
All right, we're getting more and more guests, and like I said, for those of you that are willing and able, let us know where you're from. Johannesburg, that's awesome. We're going to be there in just about 2 months.
Yeah, we're coming to Joburg again to train some teachers with the Ellen Gray philanthropies.
It's awesome.
And Eric, I'd be curious to know if you're affiliated with them in any way, or you're just is this a pure coincidence? Northern Indiana, welcome. Whoa, John, welcome. Horace Robertson, North Carolina. Got a lot of stuff happening in North Carolina, Horace. Glad you're here. Guatemala, Juan Fernando. Welcome, Guatemala. My son Owen is very, very active and has spent a lot of time in Guatemala. Kristen in Omaha.
We have
Monticello, Utah. Wow, awesome.
Well,
we just did some training at University of Utah a couple months ago.
We did. Just a few housekeeping things here real quick before we kick it off. This event is being recorded, and we will share the recording along with the slides and everything via email within 24 hours. So by tomorrow afternoon, you will have that. We will take questions and comments about halfway through and then again at the end. So we want this to be interactive. Please feel free to share any questions, comments, pushback, anything you might have throughout, and we'll do our best to address everything that we can with the time that allows. So now that I think we've got quite a big group of attendees here now. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to our founder and CEO, Gary Schoeniger, and he will take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you, Joni. And Joni, I'm sorry if I was busy reading the names and where people are from, and I wasn't paying attention, but we want this to be interactive. And I heard you say that, put your questions, comments, whatever, we'll have plenty of time. So I just want to reiterate that Joni will pop her smiling face back in here, maybe around 20-25 of, as we start to see questions and comments either in the Q&A or the chat function. Again, please send your comments, and it helps us a lot. And so, hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Gary Schoeniger. Look, we got people from Kenya here, Joni. Unbelievable. Fatima from Paris. Welcome. This is fabulous. London South Bank University. Fabulous. It's great to see the international attendance here. Very, very exciting. My name is Gary Schoeniger. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, and I'm honored to be spending this time with you today. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey, throw a lot of stuff at you relatively quickly. Again, I want this to be interactive. But I think there's something really interesting and important here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. And let's make sure we can get all this technology working. Can you see that, Joni, my screen okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So the title of our webinar today is Cultivating Entrepreneurial Mindsets in Classrooms, Organizations, and Communities. And so this really begins with this question I've been trying to answer for more than 30 years, which is essentially, how do underdogs win? And I became obsessed with this question insofar as, you know, I wanted to look at people who come from, you know, let's just say people who have no particular advantage in life, how they manage to recognize opportunities, how do they manage to bring these opportunities to life in a way that benefits them, benefits their organizations, their communities, and so forth. How does this happen? And I really have tripped into something through more than 30 years of research that I think is quite fascinating. And I want to dig into this a little bit, just kind of give you some of the highlight points here. But the big idea here is that these ideas can empower people in myriad ways. And part of the work we're trying to do is to broaden the conversation around entrepreneurship beyond just this, you know, idea of this is for people who want to start a business. And one of the things I'm encouraging folks like you to do is to stop thinking about entrepreneurship in a binary way. You're either an entrepreneur or you're an employee. That's really one of the big ideas that I want to get to. So fast forward 2008, I got hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose, California, to do two things, basically. One was to do a gap analysis, as they called it, in the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in North America. And then the second thing is to sort of fill in the gaps. And that's kind of where this work really got some traction. And in that research, I very quickly began to recognize that the way entrepreneurship is typically portrayed in a classroom or in a learning environment is largely divorced from the reality of what a typical entrepreneur is actually doing. And as part of this research, we also identified the mindset as sort of the missing link. Right? People we're talking about entrepreneurship in mechanical terms and failing to recognize the underlying beliefs and values and assumptions, the cognitive, the motivational, and the situational factors that give rise to entrepreneurial behavior. And you know, the more I think about this, it's really about 99% mindset and about 1% entrepreneurship. But I'll get into that in a moment. As part of that work, one of the entrepreneurs, so Cisco gave me a platform to do some ethnographic type research, to interview hundreds of entrepreneurs across the United States, what I'll just call everyday entrepreneurs. I was not interested in interviewing Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and, you know, the high growth entrepreneurs. I was interested in interviewing the everyday entrepreneurs, the underdogs and the misfits and the ne'er-do-wells who start with little or nothing and yet somehow manage to succeed. And what I was looking for in my interviews were the common and controllable factors. You know, I'm not interested in lottery winners. I'm not interested in people who are particularly gifted or creative types. I'm looking for just ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things. And one of the entrepreneurs that I interviewed became my co-author in this book, Who Owns the Ice House? 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. I can tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but it's really one story. The 8 life lessons are these 8 core concepts that we distilled from hundreds of interviews. And it's told in a single story, and I'll hold off on that for a second. And that's where the Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs came from. Now, our training we have entrepreneurial mindset certification training, about 4 public trainings a year. We do them privately all around the world, pretty much on a regular basis. But our training is not contingent upon the use of our curriculum. I will talk about it. I mean, we use our curriculum as a guideline. You don't have to use it. I just want to make that clear, that if you're interested in becoming a certified facilitator, there are now more than 3,200 facilitators around the world. It doesn't require you to use our program. I just want to be upfront about that. So where are we now? Right? The basic idea here is that the world has changed in ways that now require all of us to think like entrepreneurs. And I'm emphasizing the word think because I don't mean to say that we all need to start businesses, but we all need to be more innovative and entrepreneurial. And pointing out the obvious, that entrepreneurial activity is essential for creating vibrant, equitable, and resilient communities. The same could be said for creating vibrant, equitable, and resilient organizations, right? It's sort of the lifeblood of our economy. And yet we really don't understand the underlying causes. And one of the cases I'd like to make today is that, we're creating entrepreneurs by accident rather than by design. And I'm working on a new book, and I'll talk more about that later, and you can ask questions. Glad to see there's more comments happening in the chat. But on an individual level, what we see is there's unlimited global demand for people who can think like entrepreneurs. When we look at what I now call entrepreneurials, what we see are people who are creative and critical thinkers. They're resilient, they're resourceful, they're agile, they're able to adapt and thrive amidst uncertainty and complexity and change. And what we see in entrepreneurials are these are people who have the attitudes and skills that not only enable them to adapt and thrive amidst complexity and change, but they have the attitudes and skills that enable them to make a greater contribution to the organizations and the communities that they inhabit, right? This is why we see this unlimited global demand for people who can think like entrepreneurs. And what I'm saying is there's a much broader application for this. We need to learn how to teach our children how to be more entrepreneurial, our students, our workforce, and of course, aspiring entrepreneurs in our communities. Well, don't want to leave them out. So the big questions I want to touch on today: what is an entrepreneurial mindset? Let's get specific about that. Where does it come from? Is it something you're born with? I mean, the made versus born argument drives me a little bit nuts, but that we're still having that debate. But what we see in the literature very, very quickly is it has very little to do with dispositional traits. And the last question is, how can we develop it in ourselves and in others, our children, our workforce, our students, our communities, and so forth? That's, broadly speaking, what we're going to talk about today. And I want to talk about 2 big ideas, 2 important ideas here. The first idea, I want to talk about a mindset as the hidden mechanism that influences our behavior. And it took me a long time to figure out how to articulate the mindset. I really couldn't find anything in the literature that would describe a mindset. And I finally figured out how to think about this in a framework, a science-based framework, and I'll talk about that also in just a minute. The second idea is redefining entrepreneurship as a means of optimizing engagement and unlocking human potential. And one of the things I'll just say about that briefly is when we look at, Gallup publishes this data annually, like student engagement and worker engagement, and it's bad. I mean, 2/3 of students leave high school not engaged in learning. Ironically, 2/3 of workers in North America are not engaged in their work. And by the way, we are the most engaged globally. the data globally is 87% are not engaged. And almost 1 in 5 are actively disengaged, which means hostile to the work environment, right? Hostile to the organization's goals. But when we look at entrepreneurials, they're highly engaged, optimally engaged, right? They're self-directed. There's something different here. And if we can figure out how to cultivate this in people, how to create the conditions, we can make it a significant impact. So I'm going to start by talking about the mindset itself. And I borrowed this line from Peter Senge. I built on something that he wrote in the Fifth Discipline. We all have a mindset, yet very few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which it influences our behavior without our awareness. And honestly, if people understood the way our mindset affects our behavior, I mean, there should be a freshman seminar in every university in the world about mindset. It's so important, it's so influential, and yet we're not really aware of it and the impact that it has on our lives. And I can't overemphasize that. I'll try to explain it here. But one of what the big breakthrough for me that came about 4 or 5 years ago was that as I was looking for some sort of a clinical understanding of mindset, I read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That was very helpful. Carol Dweck's work, she defined mindset as a way of thinking, and I just found that woefully inadequate. And it finally occurred to me that a mindset is to a person what culture is to a group. I'll say that again. Mindset is to a person what culture is to a group. It functions exactly the same. And so if you think culture is our collective mindset, or put differently, our mindset is our individual culture. And so now we have a framework for understanding mindset because we have a framework for understanding culture. And so using Edgar Schein's description of the culture, using the iceberg, right? On the surface, we have the visible artifacts and the observable behaviors, right? Level 2 is where we find our explicit knowledge and our espoused values. This is what we know, and what we say that we value. But level 3 is where we find our deeply held values and taken for granted assumptions of which we're not likely aware, right? That's where culture can be found. And what any anthropologist will tell you is what the visible artifacts and the observable behaviors are much more likely to be the result of deeply held values and taken for granted assumptions than they are the level 2 knowledge and espoused values, right? So what shows up on the surface is the result of our deeply held beliefs. That's the nature of how culture works. That's also the nature of how a mindset works. What shows up on the surface is largely the manifestation of beliefs and values and assumptions of which we're not likely aware. It's a great quote from Carl Jung in which he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's how a mindset works. So, and I'm just really ripping across this stuff. In our training, we'll do a much deeper dive in this. But so I took Edgar Schein's definition of culture and I modified it to say that a mindset is a pattern of beliefs, assumptions, and mental models learned by an individual that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore assumed to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to a particular problem or the pursuit of a particular goal, right? You want to geek out on this. I mean, this is the term naive realism is the assumption that we see the world accurately and other people don't. Now, one of the big ideas here nested in this correlation between mindset and culture, what Edgar Schein taught me is that we can't really understand someone else's mindset until we can understand our own. And so, put differently, we can't really understand the entrepreneurial mindset until we recognize that we are likely looking at the world through the lens of a managerial mindset, right? And I'm sort of putting that as sort of the other side of the coin, like that. I'll say it differently. You know, entrepreneurs appear to have these mysterious abilities. They appear to be these enigmatic figures who can identify and solve problems in any situation. Like, how do they do that? And what I'm saying is that the entrepreneurial mindset only seems enigmatic to the extent that we are steeped in a managerial mindset. And I can talk about this if you want me to, if you can put some questions in the chat, but I can talk about the different values and assumptions of each, right? The managerial mindset is focused on replication of known things. It's focused on efficiency and linearity, where the entrepreneurial mindset, level 3, I'm talking about here, the entrepreneurial mindset is focused on exploration and experimentation. And managerial paradigms, which are essential, tend to be intolerant of exploration and experimentation. So we have to figure out how to reconcile that, and we can talk about that. So here's some aspects of a mindset that we think about, these dimensions, if you will, right? Perceived locus of control, right? We either have an internal or an external locus of control, which is a deeply held assumption that, you know, internal locus of control is a deeply held assumption that I'm determining the outcomes in my life, as opposed to someone who has an external perceived locus of control, which is an assumption that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others somehow control our lives. The point that I'm making here is, you know, we're not aware of this, right? We're not walking around saying, hi, my name is Gary. I have an external locus of control. How the hell are you? But if you observe the behavior, you can quickly see it, right? It's what are they focusing on? Are they focusing on negativity, on complaining, on you know, unfairness or whatever? It's like, you know, somebody else is controlling my life. It shows up very quickly, but we're not aware of it. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Are we purpose-driven? Are we profit-driven? Are we learning because we have to get the grade, or are we learning because we're genuinely interested in the knowledge, right? That makes a huge impact on not only our level of motivation, but the type of motivation. Makes an extraordinary difference on our ability to persist in the face of adversity. The fixed growth orientation, and again, this is Carol Dweck's work that came out of her work with Albert Bandura at Stanford. But do we believe that our talent and abilities are finite and innate, or do we believe they can be grown and developed through experimentation and guided mastery and so forth? Big difference, right? But again, we're not aware. The important thing in the fixed growth orientation is this: that has an enormous impact on the type of goals we set for ourselves. And people with a fixed mindset won't take risks. They're less likely to take risks, I should say. They don't want to look stupid. They don't want to suffer embarrassment. They'll only do things they know they can win at. Where the growth-oriented person is more like, let me try this. I'm willing to flail around. I'm willing to look like an idiot for a minute in order to figure this out. Optimistic versus pessimistic perspective, right? This is the baseline for resilience, right? What's the story we tell ourselves when we find ourselves in adverse circumstances? Do we tell ourselves like, oh, this is permanent, this is pervasive, this is personal, you know, this always happens to me? Or are we telling ourselves, I got to find a way out of this? This is temporary, this is local, this is fixable. That's self-talk, and it's so internal, it's so automatic, we're often not aware of it. And then the big kahuna here, I think, is perceived self-efficacy. And Albert Bandura is kind of my go-to guy there on perceived self-efficacy. But this is really our underlying beliefs about our own ability. And it has, again, an enormous effect on the goals we set for ourselves, as well as the extent to which we stick with those goals in the face of challenges and setbacks. So, another dimension I'm thinking about in my new book here is also like expectations. Right? What do we expect of ourselves and of life? And what should we expect that we're not expecting? I mean, again, these are underlying assumptions of which we're not aware, yet they have an enormous impact on our behavior, on the goals we set for ourselves, the people we surround ourselves with, all of it. Hugely important. And again, I'm just skimming the surface here. So the other idea I want to talk about very briefly is entrepreneurship, and try to redefine that very quickly here. But the big thing that I really want to point out is that a lot of us struggle to embrace entrepreneurship. Our ability to embrace entrepreneurship is severely limited by the ways in which we define it. And broadly speaking, some people hear that word entrepreneur and they think of the high growth, venture back, the iconic entrepreneurs like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Richard Branson or whatever. Some people think of a small business owner. Some people think of an evil bastard. Some people think the entrepreneurs, are people who just exploit others for their own gain. And I'd like to acknowledge that there are good reasons for each of those perspectives. The reasons being there's a visibility versus representation. The people who do evil, crooked things tend to make headlines. The people like Elon Musk tend to make headlines. The small business owner we can see with our eyes as we drive up to work or, go about our daily lives. But none of those perspectives really gets at, and I want to back up a second, the high growth entrepreneur, we think about entrepreneurship as high growth. And then, we see a lot of university programs that are based on this model of entrepreneurship, this venture-backed high growth, which we know from the data is it's an infinitesimal fraction of a percent of all new startups are created with venture capital. So there's clearly a visibility versus representation. I don't have a problem per se with the venture-backed high growth model of entrepreneurship. The challenge I have is that model is either irrelevant or out of reach for the vast majority of workers, students, or people on the street. So we need to broaden the understanding there. Some people who think of the small business owner, they tend to teach entrepreneurship as if the startup was a smaller version of a large corporation. And what they tend to do there is they conflate entrepreneurial attitudes and skills with managerial. And part of what I'm saying here is that the attitudes and skills required to discover opportunities are almost entirely distinct from the attitudes and skills required to exploit that opportunity. So entrepreneurship is not management, and you create all kinds of confusion. What a lot of people are teaching is small business management, and they're calling it entrepreneurship. Small business management is important. I want to be clear. Those skills are important. Once you have a known product, a known service, cash flow, customers, employees, you need management skills. But the discovery skills precede the managerial skills. And conflating those two things is problematic. So ultimately, and here again, this took me about 25 years to do this, but I'm the definition of entrepreneurship, the current definitions are woefully out of date and often very misleading. So for example, if you Google search entrepreneurship, it's going to say something like, well, it's the pursuit of opportunities in exchange, it's willingness to take risk in exchange for a profit. I've interviewed 500 or 600 entrepreneurs around the world, and yes, profit is part of the motive, but it's not the entire motive. And more often than not, we see a very compelling, purpose-driven component to it. So to frame it as risk for profit is really misleading. It creates a misunderstanding. You know, the other definition that's very common is what is it? The entrepreneur is someone who organizes and operates a business. And I'm saying, like, yeah, that definition is about 250 years old. That's reminiscent of a time and place when we made that distinction. You know, a few people figure out what to do and everybody else does what they're told. Like, those days are gone. And we now need everybody needs to have entrepreneurial attitudes and skills. And so this is how I landed on this definition of entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. And by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. By empower ourselves, I don't just mean economically, I mean we become optimally engaged. We experience optimal engagement, life satisfaction, contribution, autonomy, authenticity. There's a lot of ways we can empower ourselves. Kaufman has published some research about entrepreneurs are the happiest people, you know, are happier than an average person. I like this definition because it goes beyond business. You can be an employee at a fast food restaurant and still embrace this idea of how can I make myself as useful as possible in whatever situation I'm in. And the more useful I become, the better off I'm likely to be. So I'm using this idea to illustrate my point here. Part of my theory is that, and I'm borrowing this from Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, but the compelling nature of the goal elicits the behavior. It has nothing to do with the personality traits of the individual. It has much, I shouldn't say nothing to do, but it's much less a factor of personality traits than it is the compelling nature of the goal. And what Csikszentmihalyi taught us is that when a challenge exceeds our skill level, we become anxious and difficult to function, right? When our skill level exceeds the challenge, we become bored and disengaged. And I'll just go back to the Gallup data on the vast majority of students and workers are bored and disengaged. But when we look at entrepreneurial people, they tend to be optimally engaged. And that's another word. I don't like the word flow because flow is a very finite thing that happens for very short periods of time. I like optimal engagement because it's more broad. Look, you know, I work 7 days a week on these ideas, but I don't like, I still have a life. I have to, you know, have recreation and leisure and other things as well. The point is that it's the compelling nature of the goal elicits the behavior. Is the point I want to make. As a result, what we tend to see in entrepreneurials is an internal locus of control, intrinsic motivation, growth orientation, optimism, and a higher degree of self-efficacy. And I'm going to stop for questions now, but my point is very straightforward. The entrepreneurial mindset is an effect rather than the cause of entrepreneurial behavior, right? It's not like somebody's born with an entrepreneurial mindset and they behave this way. They develop the entrepreneurial mindset as a result of pursuing purpose-driven goals in highly ambiguous resource-constrained environments. They tend to develop this mindset as a result. So I'm going to pause right now and see what questions you all have. Are there any? I'm trying to not pay attention what's in the chat, and hoping you can help me out, Joni.
Yep, there's one question in there so far from Terry asking, what is the difference between an internal locus of control and self-efficacy?
So self-efficacy is a broader umbrella. It's a great question, by the way. Joni, I don't know if you have Bandura's self-efficacy paper at your fingertips.
I can grab it.
And he just died, and all of a sudden it got instantly harder to find his stuff. But self-efficacy is a broad umbrella about beliefs about our own abilities to set and achieve our desired goals. Where locus of control is just this underlying assumption that like somebody else is going to determine my fate or my salary or how much value I create or what I have to learn, versus I'm going to figure that out for myself. And there's, these are, separate psychological constructs. I think it was, stop me if I'm wrong here, Joni, but I think it was Piaget. It might not have been, was it Piaget that started with the locus of control? I forgot now. I'm not sure who that was. And Albert Bandura's work in self-efficacy is different. So if you Google search like self-efficacy Bandura, I think Joni's going to put something in the chat there that where Bandura spells that out, and maybe you can find something about perceived locus of control. It wasn't Piaget, but it was somebody similar to that.
Terry says Rotter.
Rotter, thank you. Julian Rotter. Yeah.
Looks like
Fatima is asking, how is engagement assessed? Well, Fatimata, I think that's a really interesting question. We have like some metrics that you can use in our programs, but I think that the best place to look for answers there would be in Gallup. If you just Google search Gallup workforce engagement, Gallup student engagement, they will tell you exactly how they measure that. In our experience, like we have clients that are colleges, universities, public schools, for-profit organizations, nonprofit organizations. They're all interested in some different level of engagement. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you on that. And yes, okay, so Joni already got that. Edgar Schein's book, that's a great one. Thank you, Joni. Internal locus of self. Accept me how's flow theory. Yes, thank you, Terry. It was Rotter. Any other questions before I move on? Here we go. Kristen, once you talked about helped all ages to develop this, do you have curriculum or recommendations for elementary students? Yes, we do. I'll talk about that near the end, Kristen. We started about, I don't know, 4 years ago now, Joni, 4 or 5 years ago with Erie, Pennsylvania. Public schools in Erie, Pennsylvania came to us. We worked with a bunch of educators there to sort of disassemble and reassemble the Ice House program. We now have a middle school version of that available. And there's stuff on our website about that. And Joni, you might want to put a link to that in the
I will do that.
In the chat. Let's see what else.
A bunch of different things right now.
Yeah. Okay. What happened to the chat? There it is. Okay. Any other questions? I'm going to move on teaching. Okay, Fatimata, let me see here. Teaching entrepreneurship. How would you design entrepreneurial mindset and business mindset and skills? How would you design it, or how would you define it? I'm not sure what you're asking me there, Fatimata. I would, I can talk to you about like entrepreneurial skills and attitudes are different from managerial. I mean, I can talk to you about that if that's what you're asking me. And if you go back to the iceberg model, like the underlying assumptions of of the manager are, we have the correct way. Now we're going to become efficient at the correct way, where the entrepreneurial mindset assumes that maybe we don't have the correct way. Maybe there's a better way. And you could look, slice and dice this in many different ways. Somebody with a managerial mindset might assume that someone else is going to tell me what to learn and do in order to be successful, where the entrepreneurial mindset says, well, I've got to figure out what to learn and do in order to be successful. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying they're different. And, look, if you want to study medicine, you should probably assume, broadly speaking, that the correct way is known, and you have to learn that correct way, or a lawyer or an engineer. I think the bigger idea here is really, how do we create environments that cultivate both, that recognize the value of both? I think that's really the big idea. So, Joni, are there any other questions in the chat? Good, Kristen,
No.
thank you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead, and how do I make this go away? The Q&A. Is that showing up, Joni, on your screen?
Nope, I just see your slides.
Okay, all right, well then I'm gonna ignore it and keep going. This is annoying, it's in my way. All right, there it is. Okay. Gotta back up here. Okay, here we go. Ready? All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about the Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs, how they work. There are now 4 different, it's inspired by the book. It was funded originally with some initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation. There are now 4 editions. There's the original edition, a student success version, which is really, really a powerful tool. High school students, early college, like freshman seminar, student success type thing, how to succeed in school and life with an entrepreneurial mindset. There's a small business edition designed specifically for people who want to start businesses. And as I mentioned, we now have a middle school edition as well. So here's how it works. It's pretty straightforward. We introduce these 8 core entrepreneurial competencies, also known as the 8 life lessons. We then immerse the student in what we call the opportunity discovery process, right? We define entrepreneurship as the opportunity discovery process it's the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. We immerse the learner in that process. We expose them to relatable social models, right? That's a really, really important part of the equation here. Stop talking about Elon Musk unless you're teaching at Stanford, and start talking, expose the learner to people that they can relate to, people who have come from similar or worse circumstances. That's how you get people to adopt a new behavior. 4, encourage personal reflection. The big idea here is to get the learner to think about their own thinking. And I become like a huge advocate of Socratic questioning as the way to do that. But self-reflection, encourage people to think about what are the external, to think about what is the future I want to create? What are the external barriers that are holding me back? And what are the internal barriers? Well, how might I be holding myself back? To sort of bring those things up to the surface and think about them and talk about them and ultimately act on them. And then, the last point here is that you don't need to be a subject matter expert to be effective as an entrepreneurial facilitator. What I would call an opportunity discovery guide, or just a discovery guide. You don't need to be an expert. You need to know some basic things, which we go over in our training, but you're really facilitating discovery. You don't need to be a serial entrepreneur or a small business expert to do this. So I'm going to hit really quickly these 8 core competencies that we distilled from hundreds of interviews. We have a podcast now called the Entrepreneurial Mindset Project. I started putting these stories out there, and I was just editing one right before this webinar. And I continue to see these concepts come up again and again and again in various forms. But the first and perhaps most, the foundation of it, what we hear from entrepreneurs is the tendency to talk about some kind of a compelling future. They're not allowing their circumstances to dictate their lives. They're setting goals for themselves. They're creating some kind of a vision or a compelling goal that they're striving towards. Now, there's a whole body of emerging literature around this, the power of that. When the brain is oriented towards a compelling future, as opposed to a regretful past or a nostalgic past or an anxious future, when we're oriented towards a positive future, our brain is able to access problem-solving abilities that are not otherwise available to us. Who knew? What we see in entrepreneurs is they tend to see problems as opportunities. They look for problems to solve. They see that by solving problems for others, they can empower themselves. This cannot be overstated. Right? Most of us run from problems, not my monkey, not my circus, not my job description, right? Where the entrepreneur tends to look for things. How can I make this better? What's missing? What could be improved? They're action oriented. They're not spending a lot of time writing business plans. And that's because the data don't exist. And if you want to engage in a debate about that, I'm happy to do it. But what the data show is that the typical entrepreneurs aren't spending much time writing formal business plans. What they're doing instead is what I call micro experimenting. They're trying lots of little things on a small scale. And once they find something that works, they build on that. I think this is the most important thing here is that this discovery process creates a really, really powerful incentive to learn. And what I've observed in my interviews with entrepreneurs is they're not necessarily straight A students. Very often they're C students. But they have this insatiable desire to learn. And they're learning from podcasts, from audiobooks, from peer networks. But they know how to learn, unlearn, and relearn on their own. In the 21st century, that is a superpower. They know how to create wealth. And what I mean by that is they know how to start with where they are and use what they have. They're very, very resourceful. And they rather than spending their discretionary time and resources and thought on recreational pursuits or leisure, they're spending their discretionary time trying to figure out how to make it work with what they have. And over a longer period of time, that has an enormous impact on their behavior. Now, I could talk to you about the underlying assumptions behind that, right? We'll talk about that maybe another time. They're reliable, right? They tend to over deliver and under commit. They go above and beyond, and they develop a reputation for being reliable. And as a result, they start to generate their own luck, right? It's really, this is really such an important point. I really don't know how to articulate it, but it almost doesn't matter what the business is. They just do whatever they tend to do, and they do it well. As one of the Ice House entrepreneurs told me, Ted Moore, said, if I'm going to be nothing but a broom sweeper, I'm going to be the best broom sweeper there is. It's like that's the attitude that tends to generate opportunities. They tend to surround themselves with other entrepreneurs, and that has an enormous impact on their behavior, right? They create this they curate, they create this learning network, and the effects of that are extremely powerful. And lastly, they tend to persist. And very often entrepreneurs tell me, I succeeded just because I refused to give up. There's this resilience, which we know comes from optimism. So this is a very, very high level overview. In our training, we'll get into this is science-driven stuff. We'll get into the research about these 8 concepts and the impact they have on the individual. So we then immerse the learner in the process using what I call the opportunity discovery canvas. It breaks the opportunity discovery into 3 phases. There's the problem finding phase, a problem solving phase, and then once there's evidence, then we go into the advocacy phase, the execution, advocacy, implementation, right? In these first 2 segments, problem finding, problem solving, that's sort of the iterative portion of the process where they're looking for evidence of usefulness. And once they have evidence of usefulness, then they move into the connection phase. But the point I wanted to make here very briefly is when we observe entrepreneurs, the ones who succeed tend to abide the scientific method. And they don't know they're doing that, but that's essentially what they're doing. And that's sort of the basis for the process. So we also expose the learner to a whole variety of relatable social models, people that have come from all manner of adverse, challenging backgrounds. And they're providing little video vignettes to sort of support the key learning objectives. We also encourage the personal reflection, which I, constantly using the Socratic method to try to get the level 2 beliefs to get the level 3 beliefs up to level 2, so we can see how that we're contributing to the outcomes in our lives. And then the facilitation rather than instruction, built largely on Albert Bandura's guided mastery. Help the learner get a small win, expose them to relatable social models. We act as a guide or a facilitator or a mentor. At the same time, we encourage the student to find their own mentors in their communities. And then ultimately the ability to think about their own thinking, to be able to regulate their emotional response to adversity and challenge and setback. They just can't throw their hands up and give up every time something goes wrong. That's it. In a brief overview, a few quick testimonials, right? The Kauffman Foundation has defined the Ice House programs, redefining entrepreneurship in classrooms and communities around the world. We've been recognized by the Papal Council for Peace and Justice at the Vatican, the European Commission in Brussels, the United Nations. I mean, the program's gone far and wide in its recognition. As I said, we've trained more than 3,200 facilitators around the world. You can see some of the testimonials. They're all over our website. We have case studies from impacting 12-year-old kids in Erie, Pennsylvania, to community college students. This was an astonishing thing, that 28% impact on student persistence in a community college. Organizational development work. There's a case study where the city of Albuquerque is now putting 6,000 city government workers through our Ice House program. Workforce development, we're working very closely with CareerSource in Florida to use our entrepreneurial mindset programs, to use the Ice House programs to help displaced workers reinvent themselves. And then lastly, in communities, which Ice House is being used in small business development, economic development. One such example is NC Idea, based in North Carolina. They are committed to putting 100,000 North Carolinians through the Ice House program. We've trained about 200 or 300 facilitators there from middle school, high school, college, university, small business development, nonprofit, prison programs, you name it. They're doing some amazing things with Ice House programs in libraries in North Carolina. It's really quite extraordinary. So that's it. probably went a little bit long. I'm happy to hang out for an extra 5 or 10, 15 minutes if you have the time to, answer more questions. If you want to learn more, if you want to become a certified facilitator, our next public training is March 6th through 27th. If you want us to come to your organization to do a training, happy to talk to you about that as well. Joni, and as I mentioned at the beginning, Joni and Rob and I are headed to Johannesburg in the first week of April to train 200 teachers in a partnership with Alan Gray Orbis Philanthropies. We've done a lot of work for them in the past in Cape Town and in Johannesburg. So that's it. I'm going to stop presenting now and I get back to the questions and see what
One
we have.
question in the chat for you so far from Eric. Is there a link between the extent to which one identifies with a career, position, mindset, and success? I will appreciate your view.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question. Is it in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay, here Eric is asking, Gary, is there a link between the extent to which one identifies with a career, position, mindset, and success? I'm not sure how to answer that, Eric. I think it's impossible to flourish without an entrepreneurial mindset. And a lot of our work increasingly has been to help organizational leaders cultivate the environment in their organization that supports the development of entrepreneurial behavior. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. Maybe you could rephrase the question if it didn't as well. I see your question, Fatimata, is, don't we need both kinds of mindsets? Absolutely. We need the managerial mindset. But in the past, the managerial mindset was enough, right? You could go to school, you could learn something, you could go into an organization, you followed the rules, you got rewarded for it, and that lasted through your life. But that's no longer inadequate. In fact, I would say that the managerial mindset by itself is maladaptive. We now need both. And the trick is, Fatimata, to learn how to have the cognitive dexterity to be able to toggle back and forth between managerial and entrepreneurial. That's really the important question that you're asking. I appreciate that. Lily is saying, I registered in the Entrepreneurial Mindset training in March. Can you talk a bit about how it is a difference from the Ice Houses, one for faculty and the other for students? Yes, thank you, Lily. So the facilitator training is designed to teach you how to cultivate entrepreneurial attitudes and skills in your students, in your workers, in your workforce, in your community, in others. Where the course itself, the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program, is designed for you to learn how to be entrepreneurial, for the individual. So the training is more of a leadership thing, and the course, the Ice House program itself, is more of the from the student perspective, if that makes any sense. Rebecca is asking, could you discuss intrapreneurship? Yeah, I'm Rebecca, I think it's the same thing that we might not use the same language as intrapreneurs, but another framework for thinking about this is the entrepreneurial mindset is best suited for solving adaptive challenges, where the managerial mindset is good at solving technical problems. And that's really where the difference is. And what we're seeing increasingly is leaders want the workers to be innovative and entrepreneurial, but they don't really understand the ways the organization, the culture in the organization discourages that behavior. And that's a big part of what our consulting work is all about. At leadership development, we have what we call an entrepreneur in residence program, where we work with leaders in an organization over a long period of time to create the environment and work with a small team of individuals within the organization to help them cultivate the entrepreneurial mindset in themselves and their colleagues. And so they can help spread that and create an entrepreneurial organization. Hope that gets at that question. Did I miss anything here?
Not that I'm seeing. Oh, wait, some things may have just popped in the Q&A. Fatima is asking, tell us a little more about the facilitator training program, and are there some research-based results in validating the relationship between entrepreneurial mindset and success?
So, okay, let me look at this. Entrepreneurial mindset, as you presented, is something I agree upon. Would you tell us a little bit more on the entrepreneurial mindset facilitation program?
I'll put a link to that in the chat. I think the page.
Let's do that, Joni. It's a
Yeah,
lot
but
easier. Like what? Like
you can
we have
handle that second question.
Yeah, there's a whole page of it there. There's some research-based results in validating the relationship between EM and success. You know, Fatimata, I don't know. You know, the way you framed that is thrown me for a loop here for a second. You know, I would say, you know, first of all, how do you define success? And so I'm not, you know, defining success perhaps in the same way that you are. Maybe I am, I don't know. But my thing is this: look at the Kaufman data on entrepreneurship and happiness, right? We know, we have data that entrepreneurs tend to be optimally engaged. They tend to be much more engaged than a traditional employee. I think there's a lot of science there, but I also think it's a fledgling domain with a lot of research yet to be done. I mean, even anecdotally, Fatimata, we see it in our training, and that people, you know, you can tell me that how are you feeling after this webinar? Like, what is your level of energy around these ideas? Is this exciting you? Is it boring? I mean, that is perhaps anecdotal, but I think you get the idea. So you're defining success as the capacity to achieve an objective. Yes, we see a higher degree of self-efficacy in entrepreneurs. I mean, that's a simple answer right there. Any other questions? I know we've gone over a little bit, and I know some of you have to go and jump to your next call, but this has really been great. And Fatimata, if you have other questions, I'd be happy to schedule with any of you, you know, some time. If you have some more questions, happy to answer them. Sarah, thank you. Focus on entrepreneurial mindset as a part of professional identity, innovation, leadership development. It's so important, Sarah. And I'm going back to the John Niederman put a question in the Q&A. Are there other entrepreneurial mindset approaches besides yours? You know, if there are, I don't know about them. I mean, a lot of people use the word entrepreneurial mindset, but I've not seen anything as robust or science-based as ours. If there's something out there, I would love to see it. You know, I know, you know, some programs talk about the entrepreneurial mindset, but I don't think there's a real solid framework for understanding what that is and how to develop it. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you. Joni will send slides out immediately following this. Yes, Fatimata, please send a proposal. I'd love to learn more about what I can send you a link to my calendar if you want to talk about that, if you want to conduct research. And to your point, we've had probably a dozen PhD candidates, take some part of our work and make it part of their thesis. And I welcome the opportunity a lot of what I'm saying here is that, I think we stumbled into something by studying these underdog entrepreneurs. We stumbled into something far more profound and potentially impactful than we originally ever could have imagined. And the more, we're putting out this basic, what I would call entrepreneurial mindset theory, but all the research we can get to help us better understand this, we would welcome that. So thank you. And Joni will send the recording and the slides and everything afterwards. If there's anything we can do to help you support entrepreneurship in your organization, in your students, in your communities, please feel free to reach out. At the very least, get yourself a copy of Who Owns the Ice House. It's in all formats on Amazon. So
Thank you,
everyone.
Have a good rest of your day.